Díomh go léir, is Mishamora McGrath, Cohirlucht Nicola Olien. Good evening. My name is Maura McGrath, a chair of the Arts Council. I'm honoured to be here at the Project's Arts Centre this evening to introduce to you the Laureate for Irish Fiction, Éilís Ní Dhuibhne. I'm sure most of you already are familiar with Éilís's work. Throughout the course of her illustrious career, which began in 1974, with the publication of her short story Green Fuse, Éilís has proven herself to be an innovative and invaluable member of Ireland's literary community. The Laureate for Irish Fiction is the highest honour that can be bestowed upon a writer of fiction in this country. As you know, the Arts Council, we are charged with developing the arts in Ireland. And one way of doing this is to showcase the extraordinary talent this country has through specific projects. This particular flagship programme was established by the Arts Council in 2015 to celebrate the contributions made by outstanding Irish writers of fiction to this country's artistic and cultural life. And also, we want to acknowledge the public and encourage the public to engage with the best of Irish writing. The title, which Éilís will hold, is held for a period of 3 years. It's interesting, when preparing for this evening, and since I first met Éilís personally, as she was nominated and bestowed with the role of Laureate, I've read many of her works. But interesting to note this evening, as many of you will already be aware, that Éilís has received many, many accolades through the years, including the PEN Award for an outstanding contribution to Irish literature, a Hennessy Hall of Fame Award, numerous Oireachtas Awards for her writing in Irish, and the Stuart Parker Award for Drama. She's a member of Éisteanna and president of the Folklore of Ireland Society. To some degree, as a result, you could say that this Laureate Award was predestined. So, Cohorticus, Éilís. This evening, Éilís will address you in her capacity as Laureate of Irish Fiction, an honour which she was awarded, as I said, in June last year, 2025, after a rigorous nomination and selection process by the Arts Council. I have to say personally, in the months since that award, we have witnessed the generosity of spirit, so evident in her writing, brought to the Laureate work. And I have testimony of that myself. And again, thank you for that, Éilís. Briefly, the Laureate programme is just one of the many ways that we in the Arts Council demonstrate our commitment to increasing public awareness, participation and engagement with the arts. We are and have been inspired by Éilís, who has brought to the role so far. And as we look forward ahead, it is a joy to welcome Éilís and wish her Gonairi Gogéal Leat leis an role nua. This evening, before I conclude, I would like to extend my deepest thanks and acknowledgement to the team here at the Project Arts Centre, and indeed to my colleagues in the Arts Council, the literary team. Particularly here at the Project Arts, I want to name Dara McConora for his artistic production and his concern for all of us this evening, John Gunning for lighting, design, and our sound engineer, Liam King. Agus Anish, I am delighted now to welcome Laureate of Irish Fiction, Éilís Ní Dhuibhne. She's already on the stage, as you can see, to deliver her lecture, which is entitled this evening, The Tip of the Iceberg, Reflections on the Relationship of Oral Folktales and Literary Fiction. Also, I want you to join with me and welcome storyteller Nuala Hayes and musicians Muireann, where's Muireann behind me, and Dónal O'Connor, who will perform this evening for us. Gur míle maigat.
When I started my role as laureate for Irish fiction in July last year, and I'd like to say a huge gurmagat to the Arts Council for appointing me to this role and granting me this huge honour. So, Gurmila Mahagav. When I started, I announced blithely that I wanted to make a literary tour of Ireland to talk to readers and writers in every county and to discuss fiction and consider the question, what makes a good story? As a matter of fact, I've been searching for answers to this question for most of my life. And it has brought me on wonderful voyages through libraries, archives, hills and valleys, blocks of flats and city lanes in many parts of Ireland and in other parts of the world. This evening, though, I'm asking you to join me on a quick sightseeing and maybe sound-hearing trip back in time, more like a short bus trip than a voyage, to have a look at stories. When did we humans start making fiction? To tell a story, you have to be able to talk in one way or another, and we don't know for sure when human beings began to speak. The problem with information about speaking and storytelling is that we have no audio records of actual sound until towards the end of the 19th century AD. Thomas Edison invented the phonograph in 1877. It's thought that with the evolution of Homo sapiens, which is about 200,000 years ago, some sort of proto-language began. For complex speech, the estimate is more like 50,000 years. And we don't have any document at all of what was being talked about, created, or invented until writing starts. And that's also rather late in the day in the greater scheme of things. The earliest writing from the middle of the Bronze Age is about 4,000 or 5,000 years old. Only archaeology can reveal the truth is a line we used to sing in my student days. Ironically, I wasn't studying archaeology, but it is to archaeological evidence that we look for some sort of answer to the question of the origin of story. Cave drawings, like those at Lascaux in France, are about 20,000 years old, and there are older drawings in Spain at Altamira, which indicate that human beings could make art, were capable of abstract thinking, and so could probably tell stories back then. An earlier piece of evidence of the human ability to make art is a figurine called the Lion Man. On the 25th of August, 1939, an archaeologist, Otto Wulsing, while excavating in a cave in Bavaria, came across scraps of an ivory figurine. It was a significant discovery, but Otto's timing was unfortunate, to say the least, because 1 week later, on the 1st of September, Hitler invaded Poland and the Second World War broke out. The excavations were discontinued, the holes were filled in. The pieces Wulsing had found were deposited in a local museum, where they remained in a box for 30 years. This happens even when there's no Hitler to blame. At that point, an archaeologist started to examine the fragments. A figurine, a statue with the body of a man and the head of a lion, began to emerge. Further analysis and research and excavation, various restorations, culminating in a final restoration in 2013, just 13 years ago, were undertaken. And the figure emerged and was named Löwenmensch, or lion person, sometimes lion man in English. There's some debate about whether it's a man or a woman, and even some debate about whether the head is a lion's or a bear's, but it seems to be generally agreed that it's 40,000 years old or so. I came across a reference to this figurine in an essay by the Swedish writer Henning Mankell, author of the popular Wallander series of crime novels, which I like very much. You probably know the books or the drama series based on them, Kenneth Branagh in the English version. Mankell loved the Lion Man and took it as an indication that people had been using their imaginations inventively at least 40,000 years ago. I find this interpretation plausible. Whatever the gender of the lion person, whatever species the animal head belongs to, we know that people do not have lions' heads or bears' heads. Whoever sculpted the figure combined diverse elements from what he or she had observed in real life to create something which does not exist. That's how the imagination works. It's how you write a story. So we have evidence of a visual kind of when people could have been using their imaginations, when they could have been making up stories, and probably were. But we don't know what stories they might have been telling. We have to guess. When do we start getting the harder evidence, the actual stories? Robinson Crusoe is generally regarded as the first English novel, and you should never say anything is the first or the last. so it's generally regarded. 1719. The first modern novel, As Gaeilge, is considered often to be Séna by An Tathair Peadar Ó Laoghaire, published in book form in 1904. 1719, 1904, late in the day. And late too, in the greater scheme of things, are the medieval texts like Beowulf or Tónbó Cúailnge, or the classics like Virgil's Aeneid or Homer's Odyssey or Aesop's Fables even, 6000 BC, but still, they're relatively late by comparison with 40,000 years. In any case, there is a long gap between when books started being written and when most people were able to read them. Universal literacy, or as near as we can get to that, starts late in Ireland. Obviously, some people were reading and writing in Ireland from the early Middle Ages when Christianity brought the Roman alphabet to us and when the monks began transcribing religious texts in Latin and, luckily, also writing down stories and myths which they had heard in Irish. The first book to be printed here in Ireland was the Book of Common Prayer, Dublin Castle, 1551, almost 100 years after the Gutenberg Bible. Technological development spread slowly in those days. Tony Farmer, in a fantastic book, The History of Irish Book Publishing, tells us that while, of course, books were published between the first one in 1551 and 1900, and you can find lots of them printed in many Irish towns in the Jolie collection in the National Library. So while they were coming out, it's not actually until the end of the 19th century that publishing really blossomed in this country. The reason is clear. Publishing begins to flourish when people want to buy or otherwise get their hands on printed material, in lending libraries, for example. Almost half the Irish population could not read or write until the second half of the 19th century. We know that in 1851, 47% of Irish people could neither read nor write, according to census returns. By 1911, this drops to 12%. There's a huge shift. 1911, almost 90% of us were literate. Generally, people born in the west of Ireland before the famine answered no to the question, can you read? Generation post-famine ticks yes when asked if they can read and write. But does that mean that those analphabetics lived dull, boring lives, deprived of fiction, poetry, music, history, news? Did they spend their whole lives eating potatoes and producing children? No. They'd plenty of entertainment and were at least as creative and imaginative, possibly more so than we are. But literature, and of course I'll focus on fiction, was created, transmitted, received by word of mouth, storytelling, what we call folklore, bundling all genres of narrative and belief and culture into one word, often mildly condescendingly. Let's listen to the kind of story they might have been hearing.
An baile agus an díal. Bhí baile agus an díal ag siúl an bóthar lá. Agus do bhí an baile ag cardíní bochta amach as a shelf. Agus a hánig duine úsal seo amach ó héamh an bhóthar hiige. Agus dífrí sé de cá raibh sé dul. Agus dúirt sé go raibh sé dul ina le héad seo a áit, go bhéadadís an cías a díal, agus do ráadar ábalta ach go ráadar á chamád, agus go gcuirfí amach as a shelafíad. Táim se leis a dalán, a dúirt an bóchal. An tar seoir. Agus béimi de réin ag déanamh páirtíocht le chéile. Cé tusa, a dúirt an baile. Bhí sé an fearr mór, a dúirt sé. Agus an chéad duine sesin, an bhfuil tú sásta leis, a thóirfar suas dom, tógaí mé sin agus túirí mé liomé. Well, by ganny, san baile, gur cuma lum. Ach bhíidir a cardíomh agus de ré garsún amach agus a bháthir na dhéig. Uise go Muireann díl leisú a bhligardín a dúirt sí leis an garsún agus seohan in ígi agus fuéhar irhí agus dá méric sí thóric sí a chlásar go mató. Ach bhí an garsún ró éadrom, ró éireach, ró ógde. Dhéan sí an bheart agus é a pusáil a gáil se. An glisin tú an ban sin a dúirt an báile leis an mac malachta. Clisim go má. Is canna héamh nach dóg fá leat an garsún a dúirt sé. Nach bhfuil sé tóirtha sús in istid féin. Ní hárid a dúirt sé. Mar ní óna crí a dúirt sé. Se. Di míad ar lo an sin, stad eilad an bhóthir, agus de ré moc amach. Moc trasna an bhóthir. Agus bhí banin a dhéig, agus pac amór eici, agus fléasc sí ar an moc. Muise go Muireann díl leisú mar stumpa muice dúirt sí. Ní, mahan culpa tú, agus tá a ggóhan féin de dhíomháil déant agat. Se. An glisin tú é sin, san báile leis an mac malachta. Clisim go maith a dúirt sé. Nach nar dó fá leat an bhoc leat, an is a dúirt sé. Nach bhfuil sé tóirtha sústid ó níl. Ní óna crí a dúirt sí. An bhean é sesin, agus ní hógad sa lomi nuair nach bhfuil sé óna crí. Se. Bhíidir a cardíomh an sin tamil eile, agus de chonicadar an tig bán tamil sús in sa bhóthar I mun canic. Agus I gceann tamil de ré chalín beag isteach. Ó, bha mí dúirt sí, tá an báile mór a teacht, tá an báile chuin agus tá stráin sé réigen in éanacht leis. Ó ná, san bhean, uise grágil, go Muireann díl leis an máile mór. Se? Is se inis san díl. Túir I mé leom tusa. Tá tú tóirtha sús dom inis a dúirt sí ag an man sin óna crí amach. Agus dardaigh sé leis an báile. Deirtar sa seanscéal go nádaigh an társóir leis an báile. Agus is tócha go raibh sé tiltte aige é a thabhairt leis. Mar is omí droch bheart a bhí déanta ag na báilí san am fadó. An digan tú? Ac sin é an scélín beag gear sin. Sin a bhfuil an.
Well, an scélín beag gear sin, that little story was collected in 1969 by Boo Almquist from Nuala O'Connor in Dunkeen in County Kerry. Micheál had told it a few times before, including to the folklore collector Seosamh O'Dálaigh, who was a full-time collector with the Irish Folklore Commission. Micheál was the son of a famous mother, none other than Peg Sayers. Like his mom, he was a gifted storyteller with the great memory the storytellers all had. Born in 1904, Micheál could read and write in both English and Irish, unlike Peg, who was literate in English but not in Irish, her own language and the language she spoke all the time. Micheál was in fact an inveterate scribbler. He never stopped writing, but he also knew and told hundreds of stories. I'm not focusing on him today, but he's a fantastic example of somebody who neatly bridges the gap between the oral and the literary traditions in this country. He was a gifted, creative maker of fiction, and he had a foot in those two cultures thanks to the date of his birth, because he was educated in Irish as well as English, and the place, which was the Great Blasket Island.
dúinach sí tír morúni tá lúlim chríise dúig maiges fón me hínse Mochrag dioí sa glór drúchtú Mochrag a leites le nealt an áidir Marach nach brianin sgwna fa cálsan Bín os gris na sínt at náha Is dúchan rí her the clíoch le blánit Twaid mag rosa the hráid an daingen The chun fiún tráis gon ár na cáine Na chaman ár is lean all in galtis Mo chúg a brach gan mér fáin na measc san Bhuir an dósa go hóg nuair a bhíosáin Imailin ghólín mar na trídán Negéist a ceolta nóns na cuilte Gelin is málín a gcór do buíoin Na menschen súthear is such a bhaidhin Néad a hídrúchta a siúl gach maidin A cain sa córá le cór sin cneasta Is líf an bhódan fiúig na bhara Déad móracht go dúigh
The story of Mícheál Goheen's, which Nuala told there before the fantastic song, is an international folktale which was told in many European countries, especially Germany. It's called With His Whole Heart by the folklorists. The first documentation of it is in the early 13th century, when an Austrian poet, Der Stricker, wrote a long poem called Der Richter und der Teufel, The Judge and the Devil, his own retelling of the story, which he'd almost certainly heard as an oral tale. For evidence, documentation of specific stories told in the oral tradition of folk tales, we are dependent on these written sources, and most of them date from the Middle Ages onwards, when writers used oral stories as sources for their own work. Der Stricker was the first to write down his own take on that Devil and the Bailiff story, but that doesn't mean it wasn't told before the 12th century. It definitely would have been. In English, the story was retold by a poet whom we've all heard of, Geoffrey Chaucer. It's one of the Canterbury Tales, the Friar's Tale. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is a good source of folk tales. The Miller's Tale, the Merchant's Tale, the Pardoner's Tale, the Friar's Tale are all folk tales and all have analogues in Irish oral tradition collected many centuries later and independent of Chaucer. Chaucer, like many writers of the Middle Ages and later, had no compunction about ripping off somebody else's stories and putting his name to it. There was no anxiety of influence in the 14th century. I know Columkill was banished to Iona for breaching copyright in the 6th century or something, but he copied an entire manuscript word for word. That's plagiarism. But rewriting somebody else's story didn't count as plagiary, and doing it didn't bother Chaucer one bit. He used the content of the tale, which he had possibly heard from a storyteller or from a preacher, because this story was often used in sermons as a warning against any kind of cursing. What Chaucer does with the story is really interesting, because he's a very good writer, but also because it illustrates to us things that start happening in the transition of fiction from the oral to the written word, which is basically what I'm talking about tonight. The physical and intellectual difference between talking and writing gives rise to a lot of these distinctions. A storyteller has to remember everything in his or her head and tell the tale in a straightforward way that makes it easy for the audience to take it in. There's no meanwhile back at the ranch in oral storytelling. The tale is told in a single strand. With long stories, and many of them are very much longer than the one we've heard tonight, with long stories, the storyteller has certain tricks to ease the process, such as repetition and also stock formulae, which can be pulled in to give her and the listeners a short break in concentration. In the Friar's Tale, and nobody has, I mean, even the most avid Chaucerians haven't read the Friar's Tale. So, though it's a very good story and they should read it. It's told, obviously, by the friar, who's one of the pilgrims on the pilgrimage from London to Canterbury, where, you know, the wife of Bath and the nun's priest and the pardoner and the franklin and all these people are together on horseback and pass the time, shorten the journey by telling each other stories. So the friar, there's a character, another person on the pilgrimage, the summoner, whom the friar hates. And he tells this story to get at the summoner, essentially. And the summoner, so he tells the story about a summoner rather than about a bailiff, but he makes it clear, it's clear in the story that Chaucer had heard the story, heard a version which included this bailiff character, because at one point, the devil, of course, is in every single version of the story, because he's a key character. So the devil says something, dearer brother, thou art a bailey and I am another. So the summoner was a kind of bailiff of the ecclesiastical court. The church had courts where they. So he's really a functionary, just like the bailiff, say, in the Irish version of the tale. And these characters, Nuala said they're like clampers or something. They're and I think they're a bit like ice. They're kind of people in a subservient position, doing the dirty work for somebody else. The summoner is in the employ of an archdeacon, and he's going out to summons, he's a summoner, a poor old widow, and to accuse her of sins of a sexual nature. There's lots of sex in Chaucer, and to fine her and all that sort of thing. So that's what his mission is. Chaucer preserves the basic ingredients of the folktale. He has the devil, the summoner who's a bailiff of the ecclesiastical court. And his devil is also a subordinate employee of what Micheál called the boyo. He's a fiend, one of many fiends, and rather than sort of Satan himself. There's that. In Chaucer's version, he uses the episode in which a cross person curses an animal. In Chaucer, it's horses, not a pig, and doesn't really mean it. And then the final curse is cast by the poor widow, and that's the one that condemns the summoner to hell. So everything is there. It's unquestionably the same tale type as the one Micheál O'Connor told in Dunquin many centuries later. But the medieval Londoner's story is also very different. He makes lots of changes. Some are formal and have to do with structure. Instead of the 3 curses, for instance, there are just 2, the one that doesn't work and the one that does work, the one from the heart. You could say that Chaucer has gone binary and understands the concept of contrast and its effectiveness in stories. But he is providing us with a textbook example, a fantastic example of what one of the first great commentators on the nature and form of oral narrative and how it's different from written literature said. Somebody, a Dane called Axel Ulrich, in a foundational essay called The Epic Laws of Folk Narrative, which all folklorists know very well. Ulrich is at pains to emphasise how literary form gradually moved away from the patterns of oral narrative. He writes, "Nothing distinguishes the great bulk of folk narrative from modern literature and from reality as much as does the number 3. But everywhere in classical antiquity, and especially in the European Middle Ages, one sees how narrative slowly detaches itself from the number 3. Well, you all know about the law of 3. You see it in jokes and anecdotes still, like Paddy Irishman, Paddy Englishman, Paddy Scotsman jokes, if they still tell them, and all that sort of thing. So Chaucer is a great example. We don't have the law of 3. He doesn't obey the law of 3. He didn't need to repeat that harmless curse twice. He knows we get the point with one episode, and who knows, maybe he was sparing parchment or vellum or paper, which in fact they apparently were just beginning to import into London at that time, but it was still pretty valuable and very expensive. Chaucer, as you know, probably lived from 1343 to 1400, and he wrote in what we call Middle English, which sounds a bit different from modern English, but it's not all that different.
The facetious curse from the Friar's Tale. And right at the entering of the town's ende, to which the summoner shoop him for to wende, they saw a cart that charged was with hay, which that a carterer drew forth in his way. Deep was the way for which the carter stood. The carter smote and cried as he were wood, "Height, Brook, height, Scot, what spare ye for the stones? The fiend, quoth he, yow fetch a body and bones. As ferfortly as ever ye were foaled, so much woe as I have with you told. The devil have all, both horse and cart and hay." The summoner said, "Here shall we have a play." And near the fiend he drew, as naught he were, full privily and rounded in his ear. "Hearkna, my brother, hearkna, by thy faith. Hear'st thou not how the carter saith? Hent it anon, for he hath yeved thee both hay and cart, and eke his capless tree." "Nay," quoth the devil, "God woot, never a deal. It is not his intente, trust me weel. Axe him thyself, if thou not trowest me, or else stint a while, and thou shalt see."
so stint a while and thou shalt see. So that's the curse episode that isn't effective, and there's going to be another one at the end of the story, which is. So that's one change that Chaucer makes in the material that he's using. But a more interesting development is that he expands the tale and uses it as a vehicle for his own interests, intellectual interests, and his opinions, as well as to fit into the overall structure of the Canterbury Tales. Every narrator can put their own stamp on a story. I think it's not so much the raw material as the personality of the teller that can colour it and make it interesting, and every version is unique. Chaucer makes great use of his basic narrative to give vent to his disapproval of the church and its power, to express sympathy for powerless people like the poor widow, although actually compassion for the underdog and anger at injustice and resentment of figures of authority are emotions he shares with every single narrator of this tale over 1,000 years. Not a single storyteller or writer is on the side of the bailiff or the judge or the lawyer or whoever it happens to be. He's always, the man of law is always the bad guy. Chaucer extends the story significantly by inserting into it a bit of a rant on the nature of demons. He was interested in demonology, which was a hot topic in 1390 or so. People believed that the devil, Satan, on Thorshore, on Farmore, had a team of little devils roaming the earth, ensnaring people. And what were these demons? What did they look like? How did they operate? Where did they go when they were on Earth? He explores all these issues in a long dialogue between the summoner and the friar. And the devil, rather. In using a basic plot or storyline as a vehicle for his own interests, Chaucer is doing what novelists or writers of fiction do when they use their plots and characters to give expression, sometimes subtly, sometimes not, to moral or political views and to convey information. I'm thinking of, say, a writer like Ian McEwan, who includes considerable amounts of information about, say, climate change in his latest novel, What We Can Know. In his novel Saturday, there's a huge amount about brain surgery. David Lodge in, say, Thinks has lots about psychology. Actually, it seems to me this is a huge generalisation, but that English novelists in England do this quite a lot. Like, I'm just reading Julian Barnes's latest novel, which starts off with about 20 pages, 30 pages on the nature of memory. He's referring to Freud and to Proust and reflecting on, how memory works and so on. The kind of lecture inserted, in this case, at the very start of the novel. And it's kind of, and that's what Chaucer does this in The Friar's Tale. Just a passing thought I've had. Closer to home, somebody like Sarah Gilmartin in her latest novel Service gives us a brilliant expose of what goes on behind the scenes in a top-class restaurant and so on. In all of these cases, the novel has a storyline drawn from anecdote, imagination, history, experience, or whatever, and the writer elaborates, shapes the material, embroiders it, and really it's this elaboration that makes the story, seems to me, at least as interesting as the storyline or the plot. But they have to be interconnected, and Chaucer can go on at length about devils because a key character in the tale he uses is a devil, so that provides him with the trigger which he can use, so to speak. These written sources, like Chaucer's, Der Stricker's, Boccaccio's, Robert Henderson's, many others, are among the earliest documentations of folktales. But those writers, of course, were not folklore collectors or researchers. They're just using the stories as a basis for their own creations and more or less accidentally preserved the bones of the folktales for us. By the early 19th century, thanks to growing interest in the culture of the ordinary people, the folk, stories began to be collected and written down for their own sakes from storytellers. There was a huge explosion of interest after the Brothers Grimm published their Kinder und Hausmärchen in 1812, the fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm. And that grew and grew, culminating in Ireland with the founding of the Folklore of Ireland Society in 1927 and with the establishment of the Irish Folklore Commission in 1935. And thanks to the work of that institution, we have an enormously rich archive of oral stories in Ireland, preserved and maintained and available to all in UCD, in the National Folklore Collection. So much for Chaucer and the early writers. But how do those oral tales relate to the kind of fiction we read today, and which I write, which I am encouraging interest in as Laureate for Irish Fiction? Is there really a connection between the kind of stories Peg and Micheál Gahin and all the storytellers were recreating and narrating over thousands of years and, say, a novel by Anne Enright or a short story by Nuala O'Connor? Our written fiction is indeed the tip of the iceberg. Think oral fiction for at least 40,000 years, written fiction for a few thousand. We can't dispute that oral narrative precedes writing. It's the early manifestation of the human imagination and the ability to make narrative. But do contemporary novels and stories really have anything much in common with that substratum of oral narrative? As Axel Ulrich wrote in that essay, Epic Laws of Folk Narrative, written literature from classical times onwards, and especially from the Middle Ages, pulls away from the oral patterns and evolves in many new ways. And Axel Ulrich was absolutely right. Fiction, the way we create stories, has changed exponentially since the Middle Ages and even since Robinson Crusoe. We can see ourselves that, like so much else, it seems to change almost year by year, if not more often. But while this is so, I believe that traces of the DNA of the ancient form are still visible even in contemporary or relatively contemporary fiction. I have so many thoughts on this that I won't manage to reveal them all on this occasion, you may be relieved to hear. I'm going to use just one example of how the DNA reveals itself in a short story. But first, a bit of Folklore 101. Just as there are many subgenres of novels, not so many of short stories, there are many genres of oral stories, of folktales. But to simplify, for the sake of brevity, there are two main categories: the folktale and the legend. The Brothers Grimm, for whom we have so much to thank, noticed this and summed it up nicely in a saying which is a cliché for folklorists. Die Sage ist historischer, das Märchen ist dichterischer. The legend is more realistic, the Märchen is more poetic or fictional or made up. So they're thinking the Märchen is the wonder tale, the tale of magic, what we in English call the fairy tale, though it doesn't usually feature fairies as such. A wonder tale is set once upon a time in a fantasy place. It's told as a fantasy. The fairy tale, you know, it's a long tale which involves lots of adventures by a young person, lots of characters and events wrapped up with a wedding. A legend is a short story, fictional, of course, but told as if it were true, with realistic details, place names, personal names. The legend often involves an encounter between a human being and a supernatural being, and it can result in an illumination, often of a sad or a bad kind. I would say that the novel is more like the wonder tale, the short story is more like the legend. I'd love to talk about traces of wonder tales like Cinderella, the Dragon Slayer, Iron Hands in the novel. Maybe I'll do that on another occasion. But for now, let's stick with the underdogs. And what else but the short story in literary fiction and the minor genre of folktale, the legend. I'm focusing on the migratory supernatural legend, which relates an encounter of a human being and the supernatural. It crosses the border or touches the border between the real world and the other world. Bengt of Klintberg, a Swedish folklorist and expert on legends, points out that feast days or feast day nights are often the temporal locus of these encounters with supernatural forces. In Ireland, we're all very familiar with the significance of Halloween as a night when the dead and the supernatural are knocking around the place. But all festivals are PowerPoints of this kind, including Twelfth Night or the Feast of the Epiphany. It was believed, for instance, that on this night, water was transformed to wine. Ihe na Dhuibhne sha déantar fian den uisce, goes the proverb.
Ihe na Dhuibhne. There were three fellas who, as they say, were fond of a drop in Ventry. One of them was Sean O'Shea, and the others were Micheál and Muireann, maybe. Anyway, they were out celebrating Little Christmas, Ihe na Dhuibhne, the night of the three kings. And they were in the pub, of course, and it was coming up to closing time, but they still weren't satisfied. They wanted more to drink. So, says Sean O'Shea, lads, you know what they say, Ihe na Dhuibhne sha déantar fian den uisce. On this night, water is turned to wine. The other two were very interested in this. Yes, says Sean, but it only happens in one place around here and at a certain time. Where would that be? Tubar Vrenan. Everybody knows where that is. It's up the hill near Killaroo. And when? Oh, that's the problem, says Sean. I don't know. Nobody knows. But it's already late, so it can't be long now. It'll be long enough till sunrise, Muireann said. But they went to the well anyway, up the hill to Tubar Vrenan, and they sat down beside it. It was very dark. It was a cloudy night. You couldn't see the nose in front of your face. They looked into the dark water in the well, shining. It hasn't changed yet, said Micheál. It looks like clear water to me. How would you know in the dark, said Sean. Maybe it's white wine. Yes, maybe it was Sauvignon Blanc or Chardonnay, but they probably didn't have that kind of wine in those days, in Ventry anyway. I'll taste it, said Sean. What harm? And he bent over to scoop some of whatever was in the well into a little bottle that he had. Whiskey, baby power. Empty, needless to say. At that moment, clouds parted and the moon appeared. A full moon. And Micheál, Sean and Muireann were turned to stone at that very spot they sat at by the well. And those three stones are there to this very day. They didn't even get to taste the wine, if wine it was.
In that little legend, Éilís Ní Dhuibhne, which I heard in Cruger's on Nuala Hayes this year, we move from the real world to the edge of the other world with unfortunate consequences for our three partygoers. And in the legends of the supernatural, the migratory, and they're migratory like the folktales, they move around from place to place. You often have a more profound, I suppose, moment of illumination than in that legend, at the end of the legend. You can say that in the legends, the veil over reality is lifted for a moment to reveal a greater truth, which is what Chekhov, I think, is reputed to have said about the literary genre he specialised in and partly invented, the modern short story. Naturally, any talk about the Feast of the Epiphany and the modern short story will bring only one thing to mind for an Irish writer or reader, which would be the Dead. Exactly. That would be Joyce's The Dead, Joyce and his Epiphanies. I don't think he knew the legend of Éilís Ní Dhuibhne. It's quite a local legend, actually, though he knew some legends. And he didn't like folklore very much. He could be quite disparaging. Apparently, he was very annoyed when Muireann O'Sullivan's Fébhlí Ag Fós became a big success. And he responded by telling a legend, a very good legend, which I haven't got time to tell you, maybe some other time. Joyce's short story, and I think particularly the greatest of them, The Dead, have plenty in common with the old legends. You all know the story, but just in case, here's the artificial intelligence summary. So we've moved from the Lion Man to AI. James Joyce's The Dead is a masterpiece from Dubliners following Gabriel Conroy at his aunt's annual Christmas party in Dublin. After a night of social anxieties and a poignant musical epiphany-inducing moment, Gabriel realises his wife's hidden emotional past, which prompts deep reflections on mortality, love, and his own existence, while the snow falls across Ireland. So that's it, in a nutshell. The Dead takes place on a night when magical forces are at work. The Feast of the Epiphany, a liminal time. The moments in the story when the transition from normality to the extraordinary occur are classically liminal. The turning point is a song. It changes the mood. Gabriel hears the song, The Lass of Aughrim, while he's at the foot of the stairs, and Greta, his wife, and the singer are upstairs, and the staircase is an archetypal liminal zone, a border between downstairs and upstairs. And the final great vision of the story of the living and the dead takes place in another classically liminal zone, a window in a hotel, which could also be categorized as a liminal space. In oral legends, the supernatural being most often appears in just this kind of liminal zone, though not usually in a hotel. They hover around borderlands, fences, wells, streams and rivers, windows and doors. They don't plonk themselves in the centre of the living room. They're lurking in the shadows until they decide to reveal themselves, and that's the point, I suppose, of the little story that we just told. You're not allowed to try and preempt any miracle. It finds you, you don't find it. In the dead, the change from the mundane to the spiritual is first affected by music. It's the song which alters the mood, Gabriel's, and the whole tone of the tale. His moment of illumination, his epiphany, happens late at night at the window, between inside and outside, between light and dark. That's when the veil is lifted, when the white, angelic snow appears, bringing him and us deep knowledge and insight. Joyce's story is new. It's based to a large extent on facts, things that happened, people who existed in his life. Like the legends, it's firmly and deliberately grounded in reality. And then, also like the legend, it leaps away from reality into a spiritual realm where a deep and almost ineffable truth is revealed. It moves from the specific to the general, from the mundane to the spiritual, from the local to the universal. Joyce's story, his own unique story and a groundbreaking example of the modern short story, includes the DNA and even the shape of the migratory legend of the supernatural. It partakes, perhaps unbeknownst to its own author, though not much was unbeknownst to him, it partakes in a great tradition which does indeed unite the dead and the living, the past and the present, the oral folktale and written literature. It is simultaneously very new and very old. And so our living contemporary fiction is linked to the fiction of the past, to the stories that have been told for centuries and probably millennia. The technical apparatus changes over time, from the voice to the pen, from the pen to the printing press, from the press to the screen and the computer. I think one of the things my exploration of folklore and literature over the course of my life has shown me is that every narrator, be they storyteller or writer, every narrator of talent, that is, puts their own unique stamp on the material they are using. So the bones, the skeleton, the structure of the tale can be repeated thousands of times, but each rendition of it reflects the special style, the concerns, the obsessions of the teller. And the really good stories tell us in detail about the world we know and also change our way of looking at life. They transport us to a larger universe. They take us from the concrete facts of life to deeper truths. The last word can go to Joyce, and I think it applies to the legends as well as to the best written stories. James Joyce said or wrote to his brother Stanislaus,
"Don't you think there is a certain resemblance between the mystery of the Mass and what I am trying to do? I mean, I am trying to give people some kind of intellectual pleasure or spiritual uplift by converting the bread of everyday life into something that has an artistic life of its own."
Lieven alleer nach morgen ossel en delve to in je woord. Lieven alleer bevrail am chrí an blaví ó chuid frí gus dean gan cheo dean gan cheo dean gan cheo dean gan cheo. Tien achrin dangen num lianta achníl an rian san ard mar tá de chló chá tainehach sa bhí sé riamh chá tainehach sa bhí sé riamh chá tainehach sa bhí sé riamh Staden gan cheo Staden gan cheo Staden gan cheo Staden gan cheo Lein de malane virte nire paulelle fingreja Bile lam no Lein de malane virte nire paulelle fingreja Bile lam no Lein de malane virte nire paulelle fingreja Bile lam no Vimmer mar weg Goeierie an oorsan Snie chuireach in een stro God hanevach se wie sheriff God hanevach se wie sheriff God hanevach se wie sheriff Staden gan cheo Staden gan cheo Staden gan cheo Staden gan cheo Leent de malane virte nire baulelle fingreja Bile dem no Leent de malane virte nire baulelle fingreja Bile dem no Leent de malane virte nire baulelle fingreja Bile dem no Staden gan cheo